In this video today, I want to deconstruct science and proof. So what exactly is science and proof? So science is a systematic way of deriving knowledge through experience, through experimentation, and rational analysis. And while it's very practical in the world, I want to claim that there are some limitations with the method of science. And there's a lot of epistemic assumptions that it rests on, such as the belief in empiricism, rationalism, the belief in objectivity, meaning that there's a mind-independent reality that it's studying. It assumes that there is an external reality in which we can test things, and also inductive reasoning. This is also known as Hume's problem of induction, where we assume that past results are indicative of future outcomes. So if I do a study and it comes out as this correlates with that, X correlates with Y, we assume that that's going to apply even in the future, even tomorrow. It's going to apply tomorrow. So some of these assumptions we have to use for science, but the real issues is when it comes to what science can measure, there's some limitations with that. With the existential domain, with aspects like spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, and with God, there's some limitations on that. Science, can't necessarily study consciousness to the degree that it would like to. It can study brain states correlating with consciousness, but it can't really study what it is actually like to be that subject, to have that subjective experience. Science also doesn't realize really that it's very mind dependent. Science is mind dependent. There is anything that you think is mind independent is an idea that is dependent on your mind. You can't know what is independent of your mind without using your mind. I don't know if you get that, but to know that there is such a thing as a mind independent reality, the fact of knowing is an interpretation, is a mental phenomenon. Knowing is mind dependent. So it's a paradox. It's a problem that you can't escape with it. And the notion of proof is subjective in the sense that, number one, to even believe that sufficient proof is required for something. This is also known as evidentialism. It's an epistemology where we believe that a belief is justified if it has sufficient evidence for it. So one of the things with evidentialism that they don't really question their own assumptions is that they trust their senses and their rationality to derive and interpret evidence. But how do you know that your senses and your rationality for interpreting the evidence is reliable? That's the whole thing, is that's not necessarily a reliable thing. Now, an evidentialist might say that, well, given our world and our system, our senses seem to correspond with the reality, and over time we have tested my senses and they have not failed me. Well, just because they don't fail you now doesn't necessarily mean they don't. Just because something works, just because a broken system, a broken clock, is right twice a day, right? But if something is broken 100 times in a row, that doesn't mean that the 101st time it's gonna be necessarily the accurate one. A broken scale can weigh things. It might weigh some things accurately for some time, but it might not. So with evidentialism, proof is subjective in the sense, what I mean by that is it can be secondary, meaning that sometimes we have pre-existing beliefs that we use to interpret evidence, and we only look for the evidence that seeks to confirm our beliefs. So as an atheist, you might say that, well, give me the evidence for God. Well, the thing is the question assumes that God can be proven, and even if we can prove some things like an afterlife, like, it seems really interesting that, I can give you countless cases of people reporting an afterlife, but you would sit there and deny that because that evidence, their subjective experience, is not valid enough for you. But if somebody says that they were, a crime was committed against them, you would believe them more than you would the person who said that they had a mystical experience. And why is that? Because in your culture, crime is more plausible than a mystical experience. But what if that's not true? What if a mystical experience is as true as a crime that was committed that you believe? And just because a crime happens to somebody and there's no evidence for it doesn't mean that the crime didn't happen, right? Just because a mystical experience happened, just because I see aliens but I can't give you any information doesn't necessarily mean that experience didn't happen. So proof is very limited when we're studying consciousness itself, because like I said before, we often seek the proof that confirms our beliefs already. And to prove something, there's no way I can prove my experience to you, my mystical experience to you, without you having that experience as well. You see, if I have a mystical experience, if I meditated for many hours and got a mystical experience, there's no way I could prove that to you unless you did my method and had the experience that I had, unless you followed my scientific method of meditation or whatever. So you see, it's not easy to prove mystical experiences of God, because in order to prove them, you yourself have to be at that level of consciousness to verify if that is a mystical experience or not. So at any rate, I know that I can keep going on this topic for a long time, but it's just phenomenal. Just phenomenal reality that we're in, and keep contemplating this stuff. If I tell you to eat that plant and it will give you an experience of God, but if you choose not to eat it, that's your loss on it. You have to be open-minded but also skeptical, and apply your skepticism to science, to rationality, and even to your own skepticism, because at some point you can have your standards for evidence and proof that are so high that nothing would convince you. Proof is a matter of conviction. It's a matter of what convinces you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something is true. So you could have so high standards of proof that nothing could convince you, and that's a self-deception. And you could have such low standards of proof that anything could convince you and you become gullible to anything. I'm not advocating for being gullible to religious fantasies or whatnot, and I'm not also advocating you be overly so much skeptical to where you can't even trust that the floor exists. I'm saying you got to find a middle ground with it, and you have to apply skepticism across the board and analyze really what you're assuming. When you ask for proof of God or proof of anything, just be mindful of what you're asking. You're asking really what is going to convince you to demonstrate that this is true. But what if that itself is kind of a subjective process? What if things can't be demonstrated but yet they're still true? Something to think about.